Chapter 1. Prelude to the Ardennes Offensive. December 1944. Europe lies in the shadow of war, scarred by 4 years of relentless fighting. The Allies have pushed deep into Nazi-occupied territory. Paris has been liberated. Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of France are under Allied control. Victory seems inevitable. But in the quiet corners of the Ardennes forest, a storm is gathering, one that will catch the Allied forces off guard and plunge them into one of the deadliest confrontations of the Second World War. The Ardennes, dense, forested, and hilly, was considered an unlikely place for a large-scale German offensive. Its narrow roads, deep ravines, and thick woods made movement slow, visibility poor, and artillery support difficult. The Allies believed it to be the back door of the Western Front, a quiet sector, lightly defended. For the Americans stationed there, the Ardennes was a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the war. The 1st and 2nd U.S. armies spread thin along the front. Winter raged, snow and ice covering every road, every tree, every foxhole. Soldiers joked to pass the time. Letters from home were treasured, scarce rations shared with careful precision. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit war room in Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched the Allied advance with growing frustration. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. The Western Allies, he believed, must be stopped before they reached Germany's heart. Hitler's plan was audacious, even desperate. He envisioned a lightning strike through the Ardennes, breaking the thin Allied lines, capturing Antwerp, and splitting the British and American forces. Such a strike, he hoped, would force the Allies to negotiate a peace favorable to Germany, or, at the very least, buy time for the Wehrmacht to stabilize the Eastern Front. The operation had a name: Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Weeks before the attack, German forces secretly gathered in the Ardennes. The movement was concealed under winter fog, night marches, and radio silence. Fuel, ammunition, tanks, and soldiers moved stealthily, leaving barely a trace for Allied reconnaissance planes. Hitler's forces were formidable. The 6th Panzer Army, spearheaded by elite armored divisions, was ready to strike with speed and ferocity. Behind them, infantry units, engineers, and artillery battalions stood poised to follow. Every piece calculated, every movement choreographed. Yet, the Allies were caught in a dangerous assumption. Intelligence reports suggested that while German forces remained active, the Ardennes was lightly defended. Few believed that Hitler would risk a major offensive through such difficult terrain during winter. Complacency, combined with stretched supply lines and exhausted troops, would prove deadly. For the men of the American 38th Cavalry Squadron, stationed near the Belgian-German border, December 16th began like any other. Patrols were dispatched along frozen roads. Rations were divided. Letters were read. Some prayed. Some smoked. All waited for the routine of winter duty. None could know that by nightfall they would face a storm the likes of which the Western Front had never seen. The Ardennes, silent and serene, was about to erupt. Thousands of German troops would move like shadows through the forest. Hundreds of tanks would barrel down narrow roads. Artillery would scream, turning snow into shrapnel. And in this chaos, a secret American weapon, hidden in plain sight, would be called upon to change the course of history. Chapter 2. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Erupts. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest, seemingly asleep under a white winter blanket, is about to become a theater of chaos. At 5:30 a.m., the quiet shatters. The German 6th Panzer Army strikes with precision and deadly intent. Tanks crash through snow-laden roads. Infantry follow behind, rifles at the ready. Artillery, positioned in secret for weeks, hurls shells toward the American front lines. For the men of the 38th Cavalry Squadron, the morning begins like any other, until the first shells hit. The ground shakes, trees splinter, foxholes collapse under the force, men scream and scramble for cover. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. Weather grounded Allied reconnaissance planes. Radar detection was limited. The Americans, caught in the open, were vulnerable. And yet, amidst the fear and confusion, one man would take a decisive step that would alter the course of this battle. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 38th Cavalry's artillery support, faced a choice that would define his legacy. The orders were clear: conventional artillery only. The proximity-fused shells, an experimental weapon of secret American design, were not to be used without authorization. But Axelson had studied their potential, understood their lethality, and recognized that conventional fire would be insufficient against the German onslaught. Defying orders, Axelson made a bold decision. He would deploy the proximity-fused shells. Each shell was a marvel of technology. Encased within was a miniature radar, vacuum tubes, and a battery capable of surviving the immense forces of being fired from a cannon. The shell would explode above enemy troops, raining fragments with deadly efficiency. The effect was immediate and terrifying. German soldiers, trained to seek cover from conventional artillery, were unprepared for death raining from above. Those behind trees, in foxholes, even in trenches, were cut down. Panic spread through the ranks. Soldiers faltered, broke formation, even fled in terror. At Elsenborn Ridge, the fuses proved devastating. Though they comprised only a fraction of total shells fired, they caused a disproportionate number of casualties. 25% of the shells accounted for nearly 60% of German losses. Axelson's decision was more than a tactical choice. It was a turning point. The proximity-fused shells not only inflicted unimaginable casualties, but also shattered the morale of German troops, including elite SS units. They had never encountered artillery like this. In that frozen Ardennes morning, courage and innovation collided. One man's willingness to trust science, to bend rules for survival, had bought American forces the precious hours they needed. As the day progressed, proximity-fused artillery would continue to hold the line. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 969th African American Artillery Battalion unleashed a torrent of fire, halting German armored advances and providing a lifeline to surrounded units. The opening hours of the Ardennes offensive were a crucible, a test of strategy, courage, and ingenuity. While the German army believed it would smash through Allied lines in days, the unexpected firepower of proximity fuses would make their advance slower, costlier, and ultimately unsustainable. The Battle of the Bulge had begun in fury and chaos, but thanks to Colonel Axelson and the extraordinary technology in his hands, the Allies had turned a potential disaster into a fightable stand. And in the coming days, the full power of this secret weapon would reveal itself, changing the course of the battle and history forever. Chapter 3: The Siege of Bastogne and the Reign of Death. By December 17, 1944, the German offensive had reached the gates of Bastogne. The town, a key road junction in the Ardennes, was a linchpin in Hitler's plan. Capture it, and the German advance could cut off Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, newly arrived and exhausted from forced marches, Bastogne was both a refuge and a death trap. Temperatures hovered well below freezing, supplies were scarce, ammunition dwindled, and yet they prepared to hold the town at all costs. Surrounding them, German forces encircled the town, pressing forward with relentless artillery and armored assaults. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing one of the harshest winters in memory. It was here, amid the desperation, that Colonel Axelson's bold decision to use proximity-fused shells proved its greatest value. The fuses, tiny miracles of radar and electronics, transformed American artillery from a blunt instrument into a scalpel of death. Fired into the forests, fields, and roads surrounding Bastogne, they exploded above the German troops, cutting them down even when they took cover. The effect was catastrophic. German infantry, accustomed to taking cover from conventional artillery, found no refuge. Snow-covered foxholes offered no protection. Trees, meant to shield them, shattered under the explosions. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. Elite SS units, trained to hold the line under any circumstances, faltered. Men broke formation, fled, or froze in disbelief as death fell from the sky. Units like the 463 Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 969 African American Artillery Battalion became the beating heart of Bastogne's defense. Each shell, each calculated burst of fire, bought time. Every second of delay meant more men survived, more positions held. To the north, along the Sauer River, American forces faced another critical test. German troops pressed forward in a coordinated assault, seeking to break the thin lines and open a path toward Liège. Here, too, proximity-fused artillery proved decisive. Despite being surrounded by enemy forces, Americans held their ground. The high-velocity mid-air detonations cut through German formations, inflicting casualties far beyond what conventional shells could achieve. Reports later indicated that a fraction of total shells caused the majority of enemy losses, a testament to the fuse's ingenuity. The psychological impact was profound. German officers described invisible artillery that struck from above, unseen, unpredictable, and relentless. Morale crumbled. Even the most experienced units hesitated to advance, wary of what lay in the sky. For the men of Bastogne, the proximity fuses were more than technology. They were salvation. Each detonation was a signal of hope, a protective shield against overwhelming odds. Every German advance stopped. Every retreat caused by mid-air bursts reinforced the defensive line. As days passed, the fuses continued to shape the battlefield. They enabled artillery to function effectively in poor visibility, in snowstorms, and under the cover of night. Patton's Third Army, racing to relieve Bastogne, could rely on these secret weapons to keep the Germans at bay long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The tactical brilliance of proximity-fused artillery was clear. Where conventional shells could not penetrate defensive lines, these new weapons tore apart formations, shattered morale, and provided a force multiplier unmatched in the history of artillery warfare. By the end of December 1944, the siege of Bastogne would become legendary, not just for the courage of American soldiers, but for the invisible technology that changed the calculus of survival. In the frozen Ardennes, a small, unassuming shell, a product of human ingenuity, engineering brilliance, and bold leadership, had transformed the fight. It was no longer just a battle of numbers and tanks. It was a battle of innovation against brute force, intelligence against desperation, and courage against the chaos of war. Chapter 4. The Secret Science and Industrial Triumph. While the frozen Ardennes witnessed the fury of battle, thousands of miles away, a different kind of war was being fought, a war of science, industry, and human ingenuity. The secret behind the most effective artillery of the Battle of the Bulge was not just courage on the battlefield, it was the proximity fuse. A device so small yet so lethal, it would transform warfare forever. Developing the fuse was no simple task. Engineers and scientists had to shrink an entire radar system into a shell that could withstand being fired at 20,000 times the force of gravity. Vacuum tubes, miniature batteries, and radar circuits, all engineered with precision beyond anything previously attempted. Two men in particular played pivotal roles in this achievement, Dr. Merle Tuve and Dr. James Van Allen. Their genius in physics and electronics allowed a seemingly impossible task to become reality. Early tests were perilous. Shells fired with conventional fuses either failed to detonate, exploded prematurely, or shattered under the strain. Every failure brought new lessons. Every success was a triumph of engineering over the laws of nature. The industrial effort was staggering. By late 1944, over 100 American companies contributed to production. Assembly lines ran around the clock. Precision testing ensured each fuse would function reliably under combat conditions. The goal was not just quantity, it was perfection. At the start, a single fuse cost $732 to produce. By December 1944, mass production, combined with industrial innovation, had reduced the cost to $18 per fuse. One fuse was being produced every 2 seconds, a remarkable feat in wartime logistics. This was more than a factory effort. It was a fusion of science, engineering, and industry on an unprecedented scale. The precision required mirrored that of the Manhattan Project. Every fuse was a small miracle of human ingenuity, capable of determining life or death on the battlefield. Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, and Dr. James Van Allen, a young physicist with a daring mind, solved challenges that once seemed insurmountable. They devised ways to miniaturize radar and electronics without compromising durability. Each fuse had to survive the violence of artillery, withstand extreme temperatures, and still detonate at precisely the right moment above the enemy. The margin for error was microscopic. The result of this effort was staggering. The fuse multiplied the lethality of artillery by 50 times, making conventional defensive tactics nearly obsolete. It transformed the battlefield, making artillery not just a blunt instrument of destruction, but a surgical tool of war. From the snow-covered Ardennes to the assembly lines of Pennsylvania, from laboratory tables to foxholes on the front lines, the proximity fuse was a triumph of modern science. It was a demonstration that intellectual power, combined with industrial capacity, could decisively influence the outcome of war. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the fuse had proven its worth. It saved countless American lives, inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, and contributed to the rapid relief of Bastogne. But its influence went far beyond this single engagement. The technologies pioneered in the fuse, miniaturization, radar integration, and precision electronics, would lay the groundwork for guided missiles, smart bombs, and the modern weapon systems that define warfare today. In a world consumed by destruction, the proximity fuse was a reminder that innovation could tilt the balance between life and death, victory and defeat. It was proof that the power of human ingenuity, harnessed in laboratories and factories, could reach the battlefield in ways previously unimaginable. Chapter 5. Tactical and Strategic Impact. Turning the Tide. By mid-December 1944, the German offensive in the Ardennes had reached its peak intensity. Tanks and infantry moved through the forests with a deadly rhythm, determined to break the Allied lines. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, a new reality had taken shape. American artillery, armed with the secret proximity-fused shells, had transformed the battlefield. The Germans, expecting conventional resistance, faced an invisible and terrifying force. The tactical implications were immediate. Units armed with proximity-fused artillery could inflict maximum casualties while conserving ammunition and manpower. Every explosion disrupted enemy formations, slowed advances, and inflicted fear that conventional fire could never achieve. At Elsenborn Ridge, the results were staggering. Although only 25% of artillery shells were fitted with proximity fuses, they accounted for nearly 60% of German losses. This disproportionate effectiveness was more than a statistical anomaly. It was a decisive factor in halting the German advance. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 969th African American Artillery Battalion, often operating under extreme cold and relentless enemy fire, became the backbone of the defensive line. Each barrage, each carefully calculated volley, bought precious time for infantry units and delayed enemy movements. Colonel Axelson's daring use of the fuses was validated in every engagement. By trusting innovation over protocol, he transformed artillery into a force multiplier, capable of shaping the battlefield in ways previously unimaginable. The psychological impact on the German forces was profound. Soldiers confronted with a weapon that struck from above, unpredictably, began to falter. Elite SS units, once thought invincible, hesitated. Panic spread through units, and morale, the invisible engine of warfare, crumbled under the weight of fear. Fear is a weapon as potent as any cannon or rifle. The proximity-fused shells were not just physical instruments of destruction. They were psychological tools, weaponizing uncertainty, unpredictability, and terror. Entire German units stalled, retreated, or surrendered under the invisible storm raining from above. Strategically, the fuses played an essential role in buying time for the Allies. General George S. Patton's Third Army, racing through icy roads and snow-choked forests, was able to relieve Bastogne more quickly than German planners had anticipated. Every hour of delay caused by the fuses allowed American forces to regroup, reinforce, and prepare counteroffensives. The proximity-fused artillery was effective under conditions that would have rendered conventional artillery nearly useless. Snowstorms, darkness, and fog no longer shielded the enemy. Each shell, designed to detonate at the optimal height, ensured maximum impact. The fuses transformed uncertainty into opportunity, chaos into a controlled defense. The tactical and strategic consequences were clear. The German offensive stalled. The advancing panzer divisions were slowed, attrition mounted, and the Allies maintained critical defensive positions. The Battle of the Bulge, which began as a potentially catastrophic surprise for the Americans, had been blunted by courage, ingenuity, and technology. In military history, decisive battles are often shaped not only by numbers or bravery, but by innovation. The proximity-fused shell demonstrated that science could become a force multiplier, turning small units into an overwhelming presence. It reshaped battlefield mathematics, proving that technology, when wielded decisively, could change the course of a campaign. By the end of December, the German advance had been halted. The snow-covered Ardennes bore witness to a new kind of warfare, one in which intelligence, ingenuity, and technological mastery had become as decisive as courage or firepower. Chapter 6. Courage and Humanity Amid the Snow. Amid the roar of artillery and the chaos of battle, the human story of the Ardennes unfolded. For every shell that exploded above the German ranks, there were men huddled in the snow, fighting not just the enemy, but the bitter cold, hunger, and fear. The proximity-fused shells, while technological marvels, were operated by ordinary soldiers, many of whom were young, barely out of training, and far from home. Units like the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion worked tirelessly under unimaginable pressure, loading, aiming, and firing with precision that few outside the military could imagine. These men endured cold that bit through layers of uniform, snowdrifts that trapped movement, and enemy fire that could strike without warning. Yet their courage never faltered. The 969th African American Artillery Battalion, often overlooked in history, became a linchpin in holding lines against a superior enemy, using proximity-fused shells to hold back armored divisions. For the men on the front lines, the effect of the fuses was both terrifying and reassuring. American infantry knew that above the German ranks, a storm of shrapnel awaited, softening the enemy and creating precious seconds of breathing room. It was science as a shield, courage amplified by technology. Private First Class Samuel Jenkins of the 969 wrote home about a moment he would never forget. The shells explode in the air, above them, and for a few seconds it's like magic. They stop. They falter. And somehow, we live. Even the enemy could not ignore the human toll of these innovations. German soldiers described panic and disbelief as invisible artillery shattered their formations. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion as men broke ranks, uncertain whether their next breath would be their last. Yet even amid destruction, moments of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared warmth, whispered prayers, and told stories of home to survive the endless cold nights. Each detonation above the enemy's position became a small act of collective resilience. Each successful strike, a reaffirmation of courage under pressure. Axelson, watching from the rear, understood that courage on the battlefield was inseparable from the technology in their hands. The fuses were not just tools. They were instruments of survival, trusted to amplify the bravery and sacrifice of the men who wielded them. In these moments, the human element of war becomes clear. Technology alone could not hold Bastogne. slow the German advance, or repel the attack along the Sauer River. It was courage, perseverance, and the unwavering commitment of men in the cold Ardennes winter that made innovation effective. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a story of strategy, science, or numbers. It was a story of men facing impossible odds, of ordinary soldiers performing extraordinary acts under pressure, and of the delicate balance between innovation and human courage. In the midst of death and destruction, humanity endured. The proximity-fused shells may have changed the mathematics of war, but it was the bravery, sacrifice, and resilience of the men who used them that turned science into salvation. Chapter 7. The Collapse of the Bulge and the Price of Innovation. By late December 1944, the German offensive that had begun with such fury was faltering. What had seemed unstoppable, a vast armored thrust through the Ardennes, was now slowed, fragmented, and vulnerable. The reasons were many: the exhaustion of German troops, the harsh winter, logistical shortages, and the resilient defense of American forces. Yet among these, one factor stood out: the devastating, invisible hand of the proximity-fused artillery. Every shell that detonated above the enemy did more than inflict casualties. It broke morale. Entire units faltered under the unpredictability of the blasts. Trained, disciplined soldiers found themselves confronted by a weapon that defied expectation. Fear compounded losses, and panic spread across the German lines. At Bastogne, Elsenborn Ridge, and along the Sauer River, German advances were halted. Tanks became stuck in icy roads. Infantry units hesitated, unsure if they could withstand the invisible rain of shrapnel. By the time Patton's Third Army arrived, the fuses had bought critical days that allowed American reinforcements to consolidate, reorganize, and counterattack. Casualties on both sides were staggering. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. German forces suffered even heavier losses: roughly 80,000 men, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed or disabled. The disproportionate impact of proximity-fused artillery was undeniable. Units equipped with these shells accounted for a significant portion of enemy casualties while sustaining fewer losses themselves. The fuses had fundamentally altered the mathematics of battle. Where conventional artillery might require overwhelming numbers to achieve similar results, a smaller, disciplined force equipped with proximity-fused shells could inflict disproportionate damage, protect key positions, and delay a numerically superior enemy. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German commanders acknowledged that the fuses created an almost supernatural presence on the battlefield. Soldiers feared the skies as much as the ground. Coordinated assaults that once might have succeeded were halted by invisible mid-air detonations. Colonel Axelson's decision to deploy these weapons without explicit authorization had proven decisive. It was a moment where innovation, courage, and decisive leadership converged to shape history. His foresight ensured that the American defense remained intact and that German momentum was irreversibly broken. With the German offensive stalled, Patton's Third Army pushed forward, relieving Bastogne and reclaiming key terrain. The proximity-fused shells had bought the time necessary for reinforcements to arrive and stabilize the front, turning what might have been disaster into a defensive success. The strategic consequences extended beyond the Ardennes. By halting the German advance and inflicting severe casualties, proximity-fused artillery helped shorten the war in Europe. Every day the offensive was slowed meant fewer Allied casualties, less destruction, and a quicker path toward victory. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered for its heroism, its ferocity, and its unforgiving winter. Yet behind every explosion, every shattered tree, every moment of hesitation in the enemy ranks, lay the invisible hand of innovation, the proximity fuse. A weapon born of science, produced by industry, wielded by courageous men, and decisive in the most desperate hours of battle. Chapter 8. Legacy of the Invisible Weapon. The proximity fuse was more than a weapon of its time. It was a leap into the future, a demonstration of what science, ingenuity, and industrial power could achieve under the pressures of war. Developed under secrecy and urgency, the fuse combined physics, electronics, and miniaturization in ways previously thought impossible. Dr. Merle Tuve, Dr. James Van Allen, and their teams transformed radar technology into a compact, reliable device capable of surviving the enormous forces of artillery. It was small, delicate, and yet devastatingly effective. Every shell represented a triumph of human intellect and engineering precision. Each one carried within it lessons that would echo far beyond the Ardennes. The technological foundations of the fuse paved the way for the guided weapons of today. Precision electronics, miniaturized sensors, and automated detonation systems can trace their lineage to that single revolutionary device. Missiles that track targets, bombs that adjust their trajectory mid-flight, and smart munitions capable of devastating accuracy all owe a debt to the proximity fuse. Beyond technology, the fuse demonstrated the power of industrial mobilization. Over 100 companies, thousands of workers, and countless hours of labor produced a weapon that could be counted on under the most extreme conditions. Production went from a single fuse costing $732 to mass manufacturing at $18 per unit, one every 2 seconds, without compromising quality. The lessons were clear. Innovation, when coupled with industrial capacity and disciplined execution, could decisively influence the outcome of global conflict. The Battle of the Bulge became a testament to the marriage of science and strategy. On the battlefield, the fuses had multiplied lethality, protected lives, and reshaped tactics. Soldiers survived due to their presence. Entire operations succeeded because of their deployment. The invisible technology changed the mathematics of warfare, proving that innovation could rival and even surpass sheer numbers. Today, the legacy of the proximity fuse is preserved not only in history books, but in the evolution of military science. It was a symbol of how human ingenuity could tip the balance between life and death, victory and defeat. It proved that knowledge, courage, and innovation, when combined, could achieve the extraordinary. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the laboratories and factories of America, the proximity fuse remains a testament to the intersection of intellect, courage, and necessity. It revolutionized the battlefield, shortened the war, and paved the way for the modern technologies that continue to shape conflict today. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was not only a story of men, snow, and steel. It was a story of the human mind, harnessed under pressure, delivering triumph against impossible odds. And at the heart of that story was a small, unassuming shell, an invisible weapon that forever changed the art of war.